There is a particular kind of silence that only royals understand. Not the silence of having nothing to say. The silence of having everything to lose by saying it. On the morning of February 19th, 2026, that silence was tested harder than it had been in nearly 400 years. A man was arrested on the private estate of a reigning British monarch. That man was the monarch's own brother. The police did not knock politely and ask for a meeting. They arrived at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, knocked on the door of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and took him into custody on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He was 66 years old that morning. It was, by every strange twist of fate, his birthday. The world had been watching this moment build for years. Documents released by the United States government had been doing their slow, devastating work, page by page, file by file, dripping details about the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and the powerful men who moved through his world. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had long been one of those names in those documents. The allegations against him were not new. The photographs of him with Epstein were not new. But what was new, what had shifted in the weeks leading up to that February morning, was a specific claim that Andrew had allegedly shared confidential British financial intelligence with Epstein during his time as the United Kingdom's special trade envoy. That was not a matter of personal morality anymore. That was a potential crime against the state. The anti-monarchy group Republic had reported Andrew to the police when others would not. Investigators had taken the claims seriously. Thames Valley Police had been quietly building their case. And then, on a cold Thursday morning in Norfolk, they made their move. Buckingham Palace had not been told it was coming. That detail matters more than it might seem. In any normal aristocratic scandal, the palace would have had warning. They would have had time to prepare a statement, position their people, manage the mourning. But this time, 30 minutes before the arrest, the National Police Chiefs Council had notified the government Home Office, as was required by procedure. The palace was not the government. Buckingham Palace learned what the rest of the world was learning, in real time, as police vehicles were already pulling up to the gates of the Sandringham estate. Think about what that means for the people inside that institution. King Charles had woken that morning as a man preparing to attend London Fashion Week. His schedule was set. His staff had their briefings. The day had its architecture. And then the phone call started coming in, and the architecture of that day collapsed into something entirely different. This was the crisis that royal observers had long whispered about as the potential breaking point for the modern monarchy. Andrew had already been stripped of his royal titles. He had already been forced to give up his security detail. He had already settled a civil lawsuit in the United States brought by Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who alleged she had been sexually abused by him when she was 17 years old. He had denied everything, denied wrongdoing at every turn, retreated from public life into the walls of Royal Lodge. The royal family had, in the careful and deliberate language of palace insiders, distanced themselves. But distance is not the same as gone. He was still the king's brother. He was still living on the king's estate. And now he was in a police car. What Charles did next was something that no British monarch had done in living memory. He spoke, not in the vague, ceremonial language of palace communications. Not a statement that said nothing while appearing to say something. King Charles III put out a statement through Buckingham Palace that named his position plainly. He expressed his deepest concern about the news of his brother's arrest. He stated that the family would offer the investigation their full and wholehearted support and cooperation. And then he said something that cut through all of it with the clean edge of a verdict. Let me state clearly, the law must take its course. The law must take its course. From a king. About his brother. On his brother's 66th birthday, historians of the British monarchy noted the significance immediately. Queen Elizabeth II had lived by the rule of never explaining, never complaining. She had weathered the storms of Andrew's scandal with locked lips and an unchanged expression, the protocol of a woman who had decided long ago that the institution survived by saying nothing and outlasting everything. Her silence had been her armor. But Charles was not his mother, and this crisis had reached a threshold where silence itself had become a statement. and not the statement the institution could afford to make. There was another layer underneath all of this that the public could feel, but not fully see. In the weeks before the arrest, Queen Camilla had attended a public engagement at Christ Church Primary School in London, an event marking the National Year of Reading, a cause close to her heart. As she arrived, a reporter had called out to her across the crowd. The question hung in the cold air. Would the royal family help the Epstein investigation? Did she have a message for Epstein's victims? Camilla had not stopped walking. She had not flinched. She had greeted the staff member waiting at the school entrance and gone inside. Her silence that day had been picked apart immediately by commentators and critics. Camilla has long served as a patron of domestic abuse charities. She has campaigned publicly for victims of violence. She had, in a moment of extraordinary personal courage in early 2025, spoken openly about being the victim of an indecent assault herself as a teenager while riding a train, a disclosure she said had been buried inside her for decades, and which the bravery of domestic abuse survivors had finally given her the words to name. Her advocacy was not performance. It was personal, and yet she had walked past a question about Epstein's victims without a word. The criticism that followed was sharp, and it cut in a specific direction because of who she was and what she had publicly stood for. Critics did not say she was cold. They said she was a contradiction, an ambassador for survivors who had chosen silence when silence felt, to many people watching, like complicity. She did not respond to the criticism publicly. The palace did not respond to the criticism publicly. The machine kept moving. Then, her brother-in-law was arrested. And on that same afternoon, February 19th, hours after the arrest had broken news across every platform in the world, Camilla kept her scheduled engagement. She had already been listed as patron of Sinfonia Smith Square Hall in Westminster for over 2 decades. There was a lunchtime concert. Musicians were expecting to meet her. She went. She met the musicians. She watched the performance. She sat in that concert hall while her brother-in-law sat in a police interview room in Norfolk, while her husband attended London Fashion Week with a stone face, while the world outside had erupted. She watched a concert, and when she left and walked toward her car, a reporter called out again from the gathered press. Was she concerned about Andrew's arrest? She lifted her hand. A brief wave. She did not look at the camera. She got in the car. 2 waves in 2 weeks. That was the public face of Queen Camilla in the eye of the most explosive royal storm in living memory. Some people read those waves as cowardice. Some read them as calculation. Some read them as discipline of a particular and unbreakable kind, the discipline of a woman who had spent the first years of her marriage to Charles being despised by half the country, who had learned through long and painful experience that every single word she put into the world would be weaponized by someone. But there was something else happening inside the palace walls that those waves did not show. Something that was not about silence. Something that was, in fact, its exact opposite. Something that had been building for weeks, and that the arrest had now forced into the open, where it could no longer be managed or delayed or handled quietly. The royal family was deciding, in real time, exactly how far they were willing to go to protect an institution over a person. And the answer, it was becoming clear, was further than anyone outside those walls had imagined. What that looked like, what it cost each of them personally, and how Camilla moved from the woman waving from a car to something entirely different in the days that followed. That is a story that begins not with a wave, but with a phone call that happened before the cameras were rolling, in a room where no one was watching, on a morning that changed everything. The British royal family has a phrase for what they do in moments of crisis. They call it carrying on. It sounds simple. It is not simple. Carrying on is a deliberate, coordinated, emotionally exhausting performance that requires every person in the institution to suppress whatever they are actually feeling and show the public only what the institution needs them to see. It requires the kind of internal discipline that most people never have to develop, because most people never have cameras following them to a concert on the same afternoon their brother-in-law gets arrested. King Charles went to London Fashion Week. That sentence sounds almost absurd when placed next to the facts of the day. His younger brother had been taken from a house on his own estate in handcuffs. The front pages of every newspaper in the world were running the story. The monarchy was being described by experts as facing its worst crisis in a generation. And Charles, King of the United Kingdom, took his seat in the front row of fashion show at 180 The Strand, was photographed sitting beside Anna Wintour, and watched designer Tolu Coker's collection move down the runway. He did not look comfortable. He looked the way a man looks when he has made a very hard decision and has committed to seeing it through regardless of the cost. Journalists stationed outside shouted questions as he arrived. "What's your reaction to your brother's arrest, sir?" Charles did not slow down. He did not look toward the voice. He greeted the well-wishers at the entrance, nodded, and went inside. This was not detachment. This was a message. And the message was the same one Buckingham Palace had been sending since the morning, the same one his statement had been building toward. The institution continues. The work continues. The individuals inside it, whatever they are carrying privately, show up. But understanding what was really happening on that day requires looking past the scheduled engagements and the stone faces and the disciplined waves. It requires understanding the internal architecture of how this family actually operates when something has gone wrong, because the public face and the private reality were, on that particular Thursday, running in two very different directions. The royal family had not been caught off guard by Andrew's behavior. They had been living with the consequences of Andrew's behavior for years. When Virginia Giuffre filed her lawsuit in 2021, the family had quietly but clearly begun the process of separating Andrew from the institution. His honorary military roles were stripped. His titles were removed. His security detail was withdrawn. He was asked to stop using the HRH designation. These were not small gestures. They were the institutional equivalent of erasing someone from a photograph, done gradually enough that it could be framed as a process rather than a punishment. The decision to strip Andrew of his titles had forced Charles into one of the loneliest positions a monarch can occupy. He had to choose, publicly and formally, between loyalty to a brother and loyalty to the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. He had chosen the institution. He had done it without visible anger, without visible grief, with the measured composure of a man who had been trained since birth to understand that the crown was not a personal possession, but a responsibility to a nation. Andrew's connection to Epstein was not just embarrassing. It was existential. The monarchy survives on public trust. Trust was not compatible with the photographs that existed, with the settlement that existed, with the documents that continued to surface. What the arrest on February 19th introduced was something new, something that went beyond the pattern they had already been managing. Misconduct in public office while serving as trade envoy was a criminal allegation against a man who had carried the name of the crown into diplomatic rooms around the world. If the allegations were proven, it was not merely Andrew who had done wrong. It raised the question of what the crown had known, or should have known, when it sent him. That question was not one Charles could answer in a front row seat at a fashion show. But he also could not answer it by canceling the fashion show. Because canceling sends a signal. Canceling says that the crisis has disrupted the institution. And the one thing the palace machinery is designed above all else to prevent is the appearance that the institution has been disrupted. So Charles sat in his chair, and the cameras took his picture, and the pictures went around the world, and the world got to draw its own conclusions about what it meant that a king could sit at a fashion show on the day his brother was arrested. Camilla was navigating a more complicated position than Charles, which is a remarkable thing to say, given that Charles was the one whose brother had been arrested and whose family name was attached to the scandal. But Camilla's complexity came from a different place. It came from what she had publicly become in the years since her marriage. She was not simply the woman who had married the king. She had built something. She had taken causes that other royals avoided because they were messy and uncomfortable: domestic violence, sexual assault, the kind of suffering that powerful people prefer to speak about in careful, distant language, and she had put herself into those causes with an intimacy that was unusual for the institution. She had visited shelters. She had sat with survivors. She had filmed documentaries. She had stood in rooms with women who had nowhere else to go, and she had said out loud to cameras that she understood something of what it meant to carry that kind of harm in your body. When she disclosed her own experience of being assaulted as a teenager on a train, the response was extraordinary. It was described as brave. It was described as a turning point. It helped other women come forward. The Hunt family, a father and daughter who had lost Carol, Louise, and Hannah Hunt to the violence of an abusive former partner, had sat with Camilla on a BBC program and shared their grief with her, and Camilla had said that their courage had given her the courage to name her own experience. That interview was broadcast on January 1st, 2026. It was 6 weeks before the arrest. 6 weeks. The woman who had spoken about her own assault with that kind of raw honesty on January 1st was now, 6 weeks later, the woman walking past questions about Epstein's victims on February 4th, and then waving from a car on February 19th. The critics who pointed at that gap were not being unfair. There was a real gap. There was a real tension between the Camilla who had sat with the Hunt family and the Camilla who had gotten into a car without a word. And what made it more complicated was that Camilla understood that tension better than anyone. She is not a woman who lacks self-awareness. She is not a woman who fails to notice contradictions. She had spent decades being one of the most publicly misunderstood figures in the country, which tends to produce either defensive blindness or a very clear-eyed understanding of how you're being perceived and why. Camilla had developed the latter. The question that the palace insiders and the commentators and the critics were all circling around without quite landing on it was this: what does a woman do when the institution she serves, the institution she has given her name and her credibility and ultimately her most personal story to, becomes the institution implicated in the kind of harm she has spent years fighting against? You cannot answer that question with a wave. The wave was a placeholder. It was the thing you do when you have not yet decided what the real answer is, or when you have decided but the timing is not yours to control. The wave said, I am here, I'm functioning, I am not collapsing, and I am not yet ready to say the thing that needs to be said. There were people watching who understood that wave exactly. There were the people who had learned, at some point in their lives, that you do not make your most important statement in the middle of someone else's chaos. You wait. You let the noise settle. You wait until the moment belongs to you, and then you speak, and you speak clearly. Inside the palace, in the conversations that were not being recorded, and the meetings that would never appear in any public statement, there was a different kind of work happening. The kind of work that institutions do when they are deciding not just how to manage a crisis, but how to survive it with some integrity intact. Charles's statement had been the first move. It was the right move. It was also just a move, a legal and constitutional positioning, not a moral reckoning. The moral reckoning, the one the public was waiting for, was still ahead. And Camilla, sitting somewhere private in those days after the arrest, was the person who understood better than anyone else in that institution what the moral reckoning actually required. She had already done her version of it 6 weeks earlier on live BBC radio, on New Year's Day, in front of the whole country. She knew what it felt like to say the hard thing. She knew what it cost. She also knew this. The credibility she had earned by saying her hard thing could be the most powerful asset the institution had in the days ahead. Or it could be the thing that, if she misused it or mistimed it, would collapse entirely and take everything she had built with it. Timing, in the end, is not cowardice. Sometimes timing is the difference between a statement that changes something and a statement that gets lost in the noise of a Thursday afternoon. The Thursday afternoon had its noise. The Friday came with more. The weekend carried its own weight. Investigators were searching Royal Lodge. They were searching Wood Farm. Andrew was released from custody, under investigation, photographed leaving a police station in Norfolk looking diminished and quiet. The coverage did not slow down. The family kept showing up. They kept attending their engagements. They kept waving and nodding and opening libraries and sitting in the front rows of fashion shows. To many watching, it looked like indifference dressed in expensive coats. But indifference was not what was happening. What was happening was that the family was in the room where decisions get made, and the decision they were moving toward was about to change the tone of everything that followed. It was a decision about whether the crown would continue to manage this crisis from a distance, or whether someone inside that institution was going to step forward and say something that went beyond managing. Camilla had already said the hard thing once. She had already shown the country what courage looked like on her face. And now, with the ground shifting under the institution she served, she was being asked, not by anyone in particular, not in any meeting or memo, but by the logic of who she had become and what she had promised, whether she was willing to say it again. The answer was not yet public, but inside the palace walls, among the small number of people who knew her best, the feeling was that the wave had been a beginning, not an ending. That silence has its own expiration date, and Camilla's had almost run out. Every institution has a breaking point, and the breaking point is almost never the dramatic moment that everyone is watching for. It is usually the quieter moment, just after, the thing that happens when the cameras have moved on to the next headline, when the dust is not quite settled, but has at least begun to stop moving. The moment when the people inside the institution look at each other and have to decide who they actually are. For the British royal family in the days following Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's arrest, that moment arrived without announcement and without ceremony. It arrived the way most important things arrive, wrapped inside something ordinary, visible only in retrospect. The family had done what they do. They had shown up. They had carried on. Charles had sat at a fashion show. Camilla had watched a concert. Princess, and who has never in her long public career wasted a moment on performative grief or theatrical reaction, had simply continued being princess, and which means she had been useful and direct and almost aggressively functional in the face of everything. The public engagements had continued. The palace statements had been carefully worded. The machine had kept running. But something had shifted in the atmosphere around the institution, something that the keeping on could not fully address because it was not a logistical problem. It was a credibility problem, and credibility problems cannot be solved by showing up. They can only be solved by saying something true. The coverage in the weeks after the arrest kept returning to the same pair of images, held up side by side. Camilla on January 1st, sitting with the Hunt family, speaking about her own assault with trembling honesty, her eyes doing the work of a person who had finally given language to something long locked away. And Camilla on February 4th, walking past the reporter's question about Epstein's victims without a glance. The critics were not cruel for holding those images next to each other. The contrast was real, and it deserved examination. What the critics could not fully see, and what the days following the arrest began to make slightly more visible, was the calculation happening inside the person those images showed. Camilla Parker Bowles had not arrived at the position of queen by being reactive. She had arrived there through an education and patience that most people never receive, because most people are never hated as comprehensively and as publicly as she was for as many years as she was. The British public had not wanted her. They had wanted Diana, and Diana was gone, and Camilla was what they got instead, and for a very long time they had made their feelings about that arrangement extremely clear. She had absorbed that. She had continued. She had done the work not loudly or defiantly, but persistently, because by cause, engagement by engagement, year by year, until at some point that was hard to date precisely, the equation had changed. She had not won people over by arguing. She had won them over by being consistently, unglamorously, seriously present. By turning up to the domestic abuse shelters when no camera required her to be there. By funding programs that did not photograph well, but actually helped people. By eventually, when the moment was right, saying the hardest thing she had to say about herself. And saying it without self-pity and without flourish. So when people asked why she was silent in the aftermath of the arrest, the honest answer was that she was being exactly the person she had always been. She was waiting for the moment to be right. Not for her comfort, for the impact. In the days after Andrew was released from custody and the immediate noise of the arrest began its inevitable descent into the longer, slower noise of an ongoing investigation, The royal family made a series of moves that were individually easy to dismiss and collectively impossible to ignore. Charles gave no further press statements. He did not need to. His initial statement had said everything it needed to say. The law must take its course. That sentence was doing its work. It was being cited, analyzed, referenced. It had landed in the public consciousness the way a well-placed stone lands in water, the ripples still moving outward. William and Kate, the Prince and Princess of Wales, sent the clearest signal available to them, which in their case was physical proximity and public alignment. They appeared at engagements in deliberate visibility, not separate from the crisis, but positioned alongside the king and queen in a way that communicated, without a single word, that the generation coming after Charles understood itself to be part of the same response. A palace source confirmed to multiple outlets that William and Kate had been fully supportive of Charles's statement, that they endorsed the message that the next in line to the throne was not quietly distancing himself from the institutional response. He was part of it. Princess Anne, whose relationship with Andrew had always been its own complicated chapter, was seen in public with Camilla in ways that recalled the deliberate visual unity of the Christmas walkabout at Sandringham 2 months earlier, when both women had worn red on the same morning, and the symbolism had been unmissable. Red is the color of courage and willpower and sacrifice, a color expert had told the press at the time. It is also the color of the Spartans going into battle. And Camilla, in matching red on Christmas Day, had been read as a statement of institutional solidarity. Now, in February, their continued visible alignment was a statement of something more specific. That whatever was happening with Andrew, whatever investigation would unfold in whatever direction, the women around Charles were not wobbling. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, who had built her own extraordinary reputation through her work on sexual violence in conflict zones, traveling to meet survivors in the hardest places in the world, had already signaled her commitment to the cause that Andrew's case had brought roaring back into public view. Her documented work with UN Women had been referenced by the palace itself in the weeks before the arrest. She had not commented on Andrew. She had not needed to. Her body of work spoke in a language that needed no translation. The cumulative effect of all these individual choices, Charles's statement, William and Kate's alignment, and Camilla's visible solidarity, Sophie's continued advocacy work, was a portrait of an institution that was not fracturing. An institution that was, in the specific and unusual and difficult way that this particular family operates, closing ranks. Not around Andrew, around itself. Around the idea that the institution was more than its most damaged member, around the possibility that a monarchy could navigate something this serious and come out the other side still standing. But standing alone is not enough. An institution that survives a crisis is not the same as an institution that emerges from one with any moral authority intact. And moral authority, in the end, is what makes the monarchy matter to the people whose consent gives it meaning. This is where Camilla's particular position became, in the strange arithmetic of this crisis, the most significant factor of all. The king had spoken with the authority of the crown. His statement was necessary, and it was right, and it would go down in the record as the appropriate monarchical response to an impossible situation. But monarchical authority is constitutional. It is the authority of a position. What the country was also looking for, without quite being able to name it, was the authority of a person. Someone who had done the thing that Andrew's alleged behavior was connected to in its darkest possible dimension. Someone who had stood in front of survivors. Someone who had made themselves personally accountable to the cause, not as a patron in a suit attending a gala, but as a human being who had sat with the pain and named it from a place of personal understanding. There's only one person in the British royal family who occupies that position. There has only ever been one. And the timing of what Camilla would say or not say in the weeks following the arrest became the quiet center of the story that the headlines were telling loudly all around it. The loud story was Andrew's legal situation, the investigation, the police searches, the documents, the statements. The quiet story was whether the person who had done the most morally serious work inside that institution would find a way to make that work mean something in this particular moment. The argument against speaking was real. UK reporting restrictions around active criminal investigations are serious and specific. They're designed to protect the integrity of any potential future jury trial. The palace's legal advisors had almost certainly drawn clear lines around what could and could not be said without creating a problem. The never complain, never explain rule exists not only because it is dignified, but because speaking creates liability, creates inconsistency, creates pressure to say more. One statement invites the next question. The argument for speaking, or for finding a form of speaking that stayed within the legal lines while still doing something real, was also real. Silence in the face of a specific kind of harm, when you have publicly claimed the right to speak about that harm, has a corrosive effect. It does not just leave a gap. It actively undermines the credibility of everything said before it. If the advocacy had been real, the silence had to be explained. If the silence could not be explained, the advocacy lost some of its meaning. What ultimately happened was not a dramatic press conference. It was not a prepared statement or a filmed address to the nation. It was something more characteristically Camilla than either of those things. It was the continuation of work already in motion, the kind of work that requires no announcement, because it was never about the announcement. She continued her advocacy. She kept her patronages active. She stayed visible in the charities that serve the exact population whose suffering Andrew's alleged behavior had once again dragged into public view. She did not speak about Andrew. She could not, legally or institutionally, speak about Andrew. But she showed up repeatedly in the rooms where the people most affected by the kind of harm his name had come to represent were trying to rebuild their lives. And within the palace itself, among the family and the staff and the advisors who had been navigating this together since the morning the police cars arrived in Sandringham, there was a growing recognition that the institution had handled something genuinely unprecedented in a way that was, if not perfect, at least coherent. That Charles had led from the front, that the family had held together, that the silence where silence was required had been disciplined rather than dishonest, and that the action where action was possible had been meaningful rather than performative. The crisis was not over. Andrew was still under investigation. The documents would keep surfacing. The questions would not stop. The monarchy's future was still bound up in whether it could convince a modern public that it was worth keeping, that it served something real, that the institution was not simply a collection of very expensive people in very old buildings saying very careful things to protect themselves. But on the specific question of whether the royal family had collapsed under the pressure of the most explosive moment any of them had faced in this era, the answer was becoming clear. They had not collapsed. They had done what the best version of that institution can do in its worst moments. They had stayed in the room. They had kept their faces level. They had let the law do its work without obstruction and without theater. They had, in the language of their own most enduring value, carried on. Camilla, the woman who had come the furthest of any of them and had the most to lose and had built her credibility the hardest way through slow and unglamorous and deeply personal work, was still in the room, still waving when the cameras were on her, still working when the cameras were not, still carrying somewhere behind the level face and the lifted hand the full weight of what she knew, what she had experienced, what she had promised, standing in front of survivors and next to the Hunt family on the first morning of the new year, that she would not stop fighting for. A wave is not an ending. It is sometimes a promise that the real answer is still coming, that the work continues past the noise, that the person doing it knows the difference between silence as surrender and silence as the long breath you take before you say the thing that actually matters. The chaos had been explosive. The family had been tested. And the verdict, written not in any statement, but in the accumulation of every single unglamorous choice made in the days when the whole world was watching, was this. They had held.